Hey, what is going on, guys? This is Slime Boss here, and welcome back to another Slime Boss chat. Today, I want to talk about a topic that, it's kind of in the same line as the sequels video that I made. In that video, I was more so talking about, like, games that aren't, like, numbered sequels, and that sequels can take on many types. Today, I want to talk about re-releases, because this has been a topic of contingency for quite a while now. And it's something that's kind of been weighing on my mind for a while, because I've seen people talk about it like all the time. Like Scott the Waz made a video on it, and other people made a video on it, and most of them came to the right conclusion. I think that a lot of people are just wrong and very confused on it, and if anything, the developers are like 9 times out of 10 completely wrong about things, and I'll show examples here soon. But on my notes here, I have like a little bit of like a sort of like a flow chart. I can't really like recreate this on screen, so I hope you can like imagine it in your head. But the way that I see it personally is that there's this overarching umbrella, and this is for any sort of media, just whether it's music, art, books, movies, TV shows, whatever. This is just the umbrella thing called a release. And what this means, or it's just a thing, really. It's just like a thing comes out. That's all that it means. It's just, there's a brand new keyboard. It came out, it released. You can go online and say, okay, this keyboard came out on X date. That's a release. It was just a thing that came out, right? You could say that this could be a birth date. If this is like you were born, you came into existence on this day, right? That's what a release is. It's just a thing that came out, right? And then you have 3 sort of, or more like 2 subcategories of that. You have a re-release, and then you have a normal release, and then you have kind of subgenres on it. This whole video is going to be about re-releases, so let's talk about what the regular releases are. So a re-release should be pretty self-explanatory. That is also kind of an umbrella term. It is not really something that, it's not a specific thing that you talk about with something. It is just sort of an umbrella term, which means that it has come out again. It came out at a later date, right? It came out, and it came out at one point in time in the past, and now it's coming out again later. So when it comes to products like this is like, okay, let's go back to the keyboard example, right? Let's say they only had like a limited stock, and it wasn't like consistently being released after that. That would be a re-release. It would be like, hey, like, we're restocking this keyboard. It came out again. Sometimes they even add improvements to the keyboard, which is what we'll get into with the more specifics later on. It came out again. It's a pretty umbrella, pretty commonly used term. And then there's just the regular release again. But that actually gets broken down as well. And this could be broken down into just the standard release. It's a game or a thing that comes out. And I should actually grab some examples, but let's just say, do I have any examples right here? Yep, I do. So this right here would be an example of a release. It's a new game. It came out fresh, and whatever the release date was, this is a new game, fresh release. However, say for example, Ratchet and Clank came out on the same day. Keyword, the difference between a re-release and a release is that it has to come out on the same day. Let's say, for example, Ratchet and Clank came out on the exact same day on Xbox. What that would mean is that is something called a cross-platform release. And this is something that's done like every single game that's third party or second party or whatever, like your Call of Duties, your whatever else. This is something that just kind of releases on all platforms. That would be something called a cross-platform release. So let's say you have, for example, Ratchet and Clank again. That would just be a standard release. It comes out, it's a brand new game, and it's only exclusive to one console. It just came out. It's just one game, standalone by itself. But in the case of Call of Duty, there are multiple releases. It came out on Xbox, it came out on PlayStation, sometimes it came out on Nintendo, it used to, back in the day. And that would be a cross-platform release. Sometimes when we're in the middle of a generation or a transitional period of a generation, sometimes some games will release on 2 different platforms, again, day and date with each other. Sometimes and especially nowadays with Game Pass, a lot of the times Xbox will have something as a limited time exclusive on Game Pass. What that means is that eventually, at a later date, it will come to PlayStation. But because of that, it now becomes that PlayStation version becomes a re-release because it was released on a different day. If they were released on the exact same day on different platforms, that's when it would be called a cross-platform. Or in the case if it comes to PS3, PS4, or PS4, PS5, or Xbox One/360, or Xbox One/Series, and a lot of Series games are, actually the majority of Series games are this cross-generation. But it means they release on 2 different platforms by the same company, and like 90% of Series X games are cross-generation games. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat to this. There's 2 examples that I bring up, the Call of Duties and the Sonics, and because they used to release on damn near everything, and a lot of licensed games as well, so like Battle for Bikini Bottom or other games like that, and those would be cross-platform, cross-generation. But sometimes, mostly in the case of Sonic and the licensed games, but sometimes even Call of Duty, they would release games on Game Boy or Game Boy Advance or DS. And in those cases, and with the case of Call of Duty, they usually labeled it differently. So in the case of Black Ops, for example, that came out on like a bajillion different consoles, but it also came out on DS. And in that case, it was still called the same thing, but it was released on the same day, but that would just be a separate release. It would be a different game. It's not considered cross-platform or cross-generation because that is just a different game altogether. And a better example of this would be like Sonic 06. Everyone calls it Sonic 06, but the actual name of Sonic 06 is Sonic the Hedgehog. And Sonic the Hedgehog is the exact same name of like 2 other games. Sonic the Hedgehog on Genesis, and Sonic the Hedgehog on Master System. Those are different games altogether. Like all 3 of those games I just listed are all different games. So in the same case as this, just because it released on the same day, it's still a different game. I mean, think about it. If I think it was kind of Animal Crossing New Horizons and Doom Eternal both came out on the same day. They're still 2 different games. Just because they released on the same day doesn't mean that they're the same game. Now that's more an obvious example, but if they have the same exact name, it doesn't mean that they're the exact same game. And that's just a weird specific off example. But usually 9 times out of 10 they'll like make sure you know that this isn't a different game. In the case of Black Ops, they also released Black Ops on PS Vita, but it wasn't called Black Ops. It was called Black Ops. It was called Black Ops Declassified. That you can already tell is a different game because it has a different name. But the Black Ops on DS is still just called Black Ops. It looks the same, everything, but it's a different game. And the same thing for a lot of licensed games, Battle for Bikini Bottom and other things like that. Those are like different games on non-console platforms. So when you think about those games, those aren't cross-platform or cross-generational games. Those are just straight-up different games, period. A good example of this is like way back in the day, I really thought that Nicktoons Battle for Bikini Bottom on DS and Game Boy were the exact same game. No, those are 2 different entirely games. And I grew up mostly with the Game Boy one, or the Game Boy Advance one more specifically, and there was also the PlayStation and GameCube one, which was vastly different from both the DS and the Game Boy Advance one. So you got to keep that in mind as well. So there's cross-platform where it releases, so you have a release, a game just comes out brand new, smack dab. Then there's something called cross-platform where it can release on the exact same day on PlayStation and Xbox. And then there's cross-generation where it releases on PS4 and PS5. And then there's the weird little other handheld versions that even though they're the exact same name and they released on the exact same day, they're just a different game altogether. And of course, the last little caveat that I mentioned before is when they have timed exclusives where a game exclusively releases on Xbox and then it releases later on PlayStation. That's when we start getting into re-release territory. And there's one other topic that I didn't mention here, and that's just sequels. Sequels, I guess in the case of Ratchet and Clank as well, it's just a game that came out later. In the same sort of setting. Again, it's just a normal release, nothing special about it. So now we get into the overarching topic of re-releases. Re-releases, again, is an umbrella term for everything that I'm about to say. Unlike regular releases, where it's pretty pinpoint what it's called, re-releases sort of have like a sliding scale, and it's kind of weird because that's where developers kind of get creative about it, and it's like, oh, we'll call this a remake, or we'll call this a remaster, and it's like no one really knows what the fuck they're talking about because it just kind of exists on a line somewhere. And I can list off like a billion different examples, but this video would go on way too long. So let's start at the very bottom of the scale, and that is, and again, on one side of the scale, it depends on like how much content and how much has changed within the game. So you go on one side of the scale, there's basically nothing changed, and on the other side of the scale, it's like a completely different game. So on one side of the scale, we have something called a port. A port is just one game on another platform. Actually, no, I'm not even gonna say that. It's a game that released on a different day. So whether that's, again, that cross-platform thing I was talking about where PlayStation got the game later, or again, any time that a game is already out and was released at a later time, because sometimes they re-release the game with like Game of the Year edition, and it really doesn't really add anything, but that would still be considered a port. Anytime that a game releases at a later date without any changes, zero changes, it's just the exact same game on a different platform or at a different time. That's all it is, zero changes. That is a port. Then there's something called that, and it's only been recognized mostly in the Switch era, and that is the enhanced port. An enhanced port is a new classification of what a re-release could be, and that is just the exact same game, by and large, but with a few little tweaks to it. Not enough to call it a remaster, not enough to call it a remake, but mostly these are like your Mario Kart 8 Deluxes, your Tropical Freezes on Switch, your even Tropical Freeze is very hard to say if that's an enhanced port or not, but a port, I would say, is just like, it's just the same game released at a later time, usually on a different platform. And an enhanced port is the exact same thing, except it has additions and changes and modifications to the game for, you know, whether that's bug fixes, quality of life fixes, but again, they're or additional characters or DLC included, or again, Game of the Year's edition that have all the DLC included, things like that. That would be an enhanced port, because if you look at the base game that was released initially compared to what this game is now, I mean, look at Mario Kart 8 on Wii U and look at Mario Kart 8 on the Switch. That's a very drastic difference, but it's still an enhanced port because they didn't make any changes to the base Mario Kart 8 game. They could technically still put this on Wii U if they wanted to. Now let's talk about the next scale up, and that is a remaster. And now where the difference between an enhanced port and an enhanced and a remaster comes in is that the enhanced port is still the exact same game. When we look at a remaster, usually the graphics or visuals are slightly improved. Now this could, again, this is marginally like your Zelda, your HD Zeldas, your like the Chrono Trigger on DS, or, you know, just minor little, actually not Chrono Trigger on DS, I'm gonna ignore that because that's a weird case. Again, like I said, it's a sliding scale. These are just basically minor visual improvements. So like in the case of like Mario Kart, when it came to Switch, some people might say, oh, it's a remaster because it locks itself at, I don't even know if this is true, it has like better frame rate or whatever than it did on Wii U. That's not enough to call it a remake or a remaster. I need to make sure I get my terms right. Again, hey, it's not a remake either, to be fair. But for the case of the Zelda games on Wii U, the HD Zeldas, those are like straight up remasters. Like, they're by and large the same game, they just look significantly better. I think they usually run on a different engine, I could be wrong about that. But they look marginally better. A lot of the times it's standard definition to HD or standard definition to 4K or whatever. But usually they don't make too many changes to the gameplay. If anything, a lot of what they change is amounts to how much they would add in an enhanced remaster or an enhanced port. So adding additional characters, changing the way the controls work because it's on a different platform. You know, in the case of the Wii U, they added gamepad functionality, things like that. So usually it's up-resing the graphics. Again, just it doesn't, like, if you took a screenshot of Twilight Princess on the GameCube and Twilight Princess on the Wii U, you would say, oh wow, the Wii U version looks leagues better, but they still roughly look the same because it just all they did was like upscale it. They just made it look a little bit better, fit better with the modern age, and that would be a remaster. But they're still allowed to add a little tweaks here and there, just very minor changes, things like that. So that is what they would call a remaster. Now this is where things get crazy, because remakes are straight up new game, or straight up from the ground up rebuildings of these games, but by and large they're still the exact same game. So let's talk about Pokemon. Pokemon is the easiest example of this, and a lot of RPGs do this, and we'll even talk about the Mario and Luigi. We'll group the Mario and Luigi remakes in here as well. When you take a screenshot of Pokemon Omega Ruby and a screenshot of Ruby and Sapphire on the Game Boy, they look vastly different. You can't just say, wow, they remastered the... No, that is a different game that you're looking at. But by and large, it's still the exact same game. It's still top-down. It's still, you know, a lot of the story elements are the same. But the remake tier, the remake tick, is when they're allowed to start making significant story changes or significant things that are additions to the game. So not a minor character thing or a new track in Mario Kart. No, these are like, sometimes they have like new story elements. In the case of Omega Ruby, they have the Delta episode. In the case of like Heart Gold and Soul Silver, they had that weird post-game thing with Giovanni and Silver, and they're allowed to do a lot more with it, but by and large it's still the exact same game. When you look at it, it's like, okay, wow, the graphics are completely different. They're a lot better now. They're not just up-resed or whatever. They're significantly different. And then you look at the gameplay, and it's like, okay, this is still the same game. And then you say, oh, there's little changes here and there. There's Mega Evolution. There's some story changes. But by and large, it's the exact same game. But that's when we get to reimagining. And reimagining, in my eyes, is like, it's almost a new release. It's almost like it's still a standalone release, but it's has the same framework as the original game. So whereas a remake is just, it's still the same game, but it has infinitely better graphics. They're not just up-resed, and they make significant changes of the game to make it better. Reimagining is like an entirely new game with the framework of an old game. That's what I see reimaginings as. And reimagining is also a new tier added, because something like this wouldn't really be talked about because it would just kind of cap off at remake. It's like, okay, wow, this is a remake. There's significant changes made to the game. The graphics are significantly different. They're not just up-resed. And this is like, it's like a new experience. But reimaginings are just that. They're like an entire reimagining of what the game originally was. And that's where I'm like, I don't really trust the gaming industry for labeling things, because the best example of what a reimagining is Final Fantasy VII Remake. My friend, this is not a remake. This is a new game. You released Final Fantasy VII again in the modern era. This is a new game built from the ground up. It has the story structure of Final Fantasy VII, but that's it. Everything else is entirely new. The battle system is different. The collection system is different. The story is even drastically different from the original, but still keeps it still goes from point A to point B, right? And then C, and then D, and then E, and then F. But the way that you get there is way different from the original. Compare that to Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, where the largest changes that they made is that there's a minor little cutscene where you and your rival take a look at a butterfly flying through the sky. That's not drastic. Whereas in Final Fantasy VII Remake, not only are you looking from a different perspective, but there's whole entire areas where in the original game you're like, oh wow, I remember this area, but it's completely fleshed out. It's a new game. Another example of this, and although I don't know if it's true or not because I haven't experienced it, is the Resident Evil remakes, which again I'm gonna call remaster or reimaginings. In the case, and this is pretty, and this is pretty good comparison. For example, the first Resident Evil remake was actually Resident Evil Remastered, which was the original Resident Evil game. All they did was like up-res the textures and make the models a little bit better. That's about all they did. Whereas starting with Resident Evil 2, the gameplay was drastically different. It's still that traditional Resident Evil feel, but it kind of felt more like 7 than it did 2 or 1 at that point. I don't remember if 2 Remake had the top down. I think it was like over the shoulder, but again, different camera angles. Again, largely the same story structure from point A to point B, but the way that you got there was just a little bit different. And in the case of those, you can see like over the course of the Resident Evil remake history, you can see, okay, this is very clearly a remaster, and this is very clearly a reimagining. And you can tell that very significantly that those are pretty much point blank put onto those, sections on the scale. Whereas there's some games that like lean more towards reimagining because, they're, I feel like the difference between remake and reimagining is a little more inherent, but like you can see like the difference between remaster and remake, they kind of sway a little bit. Or in the case of like, for example, the new Paper Mario game coming out, not a lot of people seem to agree on whether or not it's a remake or a remaster. Or in the case of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, 9 times out of 10, Pokemon does make remakes, but in this case, it's like, is this more of a remaster? Because they didn't really change anything this time. They usually do, but this time they didn't really do too much other than add the fairy type. And a few gameplay enhancements here or there. So is it really a remaster? But the graphics are entirely different. So and it's in a completely different engine. So is it a remake? And so sometimes they just kind of fall along the sliding scale. But there are exact definitions to what these are: an enhanced port, a port, an enhanced port, a remaster, a remake, and a reimagining. But they just can kind of fall differently on the scale depending on how much has changed. Because again, my parameters for what they are: for the port, 0 changes; enhanced port, minor changes here or there; remaster, usually up-resing the graphic with a few minor enhancements here or there; remake from the ground up, completely new engine 9 times out of 10, sometimes it isn't, and it looks drastically different from the original, and they have a lot more things added to the game other than just minor gameplay features or things like that. And then a reimagining is like an entirely new game just with the same skin of the original. And so yeah, there's some, my definitions of what these are pretty set in stone and hardcore, but like it can kind of free flow into what it needs to be depending on how many features are in the game. It's like, I think everyone can agree with me, at least with like Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's not the same game from the original. It's like, oh yeah, like we're still following the same story, same characters, whatever. But like by and large, it's like it's not the same game. It's a reimagining. Whereas when it comes to like remake and remaster, it's like, So it's like sometimes you can't really tell when something's a remaster or a remake, and it's very hard to tell sometimes depending on how much effort, and we usually just kind of default towards what the developers say. But again, I don't trust what the developers say, because even though Square Enix is marketing Remake as FF7 Remake as a remake, it's definitely not a remake. And in the case of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, why are they marketing it as a remake? It's very clear, like it's not very clear if it's actually a remake or not, because in the previous games they've done a lot more with it. And in the case of this new Paper Mario game that's coming out, it seems like it's just the exact same game with better graphics, and then call it a remaster. But apparently it's still being called a remake, so it's like it kind of free flows. And the point of this video was to kind of get out my opinion on what exactly do each of these terms mean, and where I think some of these games fall. And oh yeah, actually, let's talk about Chrono Trigger once again. Chrono Trigger was originally released on the SNES, and then it got like remastered on PC, and it also got remastered on DS. And it's a little bit weird because if you look at all three versions of the game, they look exactly the same. Now, I'll say the PC and the DS version looks a lot cleaner, but they didn't change the graphics whatsoever. The PC version is actually running on a different engine altogether from the SNES version. And I think they even remade the cutscenes into HD on the PC version and outright remove them on the DS version. So when you take a look at, you know, the PC version, a lot of people would say, oh yeah, that's a remaster. And I wouldn't be inclined to agree. It's in widescreen, it has better looking visuals, but not too much is really changed, and it's by and large still just Chrono Trigger just looks a little bit better. And then you look at the DS version, and yeah, it has some of those changes that the PC had, but you know, it's still in the original aspect ratio. It looks exactly the same as the original, or on par with the PC version, and but the problem with the DS version has very, very significant gameplay changes where a lot of people tend to consider it a remake. And it's hard to say because there's an entirely new game mode and changes to New Game Plus and changes to the battle system, and there's new cutscenes and things like this, and it's like on the surface of it, it's like this is a remake, but on the on the gameplay level and the enhancements level, it's like there's so many new things added to this game that a lot of people would consider it a remake. But on the forefront of it, the way it looks, it's like this is just a remaster. And if you play the DS version all the way up until, you know, normally the game ends, you would be like, oh, this was just a remaster. When you missed an entirely separate game that's pretty much baked into it, that a lot of people would consider it a remaster or a remake. You know, so it's like it's very hard to pinpoint where some of these games go. But that's all I wanted to share with you, is just sort of my opinion on that and where I think some games should go. So anyways, if you guys enjoyed me ranting for holy shit 30 minutes, I hope you did. If you did, don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.